My coworker stole my project. She put her name on the slide deck, took the demo in front of the clients, and sat under applause while I waited for an email that never came. It hurt because I had been living inside that work for months. Late nights, patched code, arguments with architects, and I had accepted small, steady sacrifices so I could finish it. She turned my credit into her promotion, and the company turned my explanations into polite nods. It felt like someone had cut a corner of my life out of the photograph and hung it on their wall. I won't waste the opening sentence with metaphors. The who was Claire, mid-30s, same department, same team. The what was simple. She presented my design to the client and claimed leadership. The why is where it digs in. I relied on that project to make rent, to keep my mother's insurance premiums on time, and to prove to my manager, who liked clean metrics more than messy context, that I was ready for senior work. She took not only credit, but also the leverage I needed to pay bills and to keep a stabilizing rhythm in our small, fragile household. I write that now from my kitchen table, the same table where I opened a spreadsheet the night I found out. The table is dented in the same place as the year my father stopped answering his phone. It's where I balance budgets and where I weigh consequences. That detail matters because I couldn't walk away. I had a mortgage on an apartment that appreciated enough to make my mother's living situation bearable, but not enough to sell without losing the point of living there. My salary was a design plus engineering hybrid, comfortable enough to cover basics, not comfortable enough to survive a job gap. My mother's insurance deductible was higher than my emergency fund. One late paycheck would tilt the whole thing. Claire and I used to talk more. I hadn't noticed when the talks turned into small, strategic smiles. We were both on the same agile squad. For 14 weeks, I led the feature. A middleware layer that simplified billing workflows for a healthcare client who was big enough to be useful and small enough to be picky. The product manager liked the idea. The architect thought it would be elegant if we could actually deliver it without rewriting the whole stack. I wrote the proofs of concept, I pushed the early prototypes, I argued for unit tests when I knew nobody was in the mood. I kept a local branch with my name and a folder in my home directory where I kept the earliest notes, handwritten scribbles, an email thread with a UX researcher, a reviewed wireframe. That mess was mine. Claire, who had been on integration work for a different module, began to attend our spec meetings more. At first, she contributed in small ways, asking a question about edge cases, suggesting a naming convention. I appreciated the help. We shared a coffee run once. I figured she liked the problem. I didn't realize she liked the shape of credit. More, the first wave came in the form of exclusion. A week before the demo, our product manager scheduled a client presentation and asked the squad lead to nominate a presenter. I assumed it would be me. I had been the technical owner. Claire volunteered and the manager accepted it without asking me. I remember the word fresh perspective being used in the calendar invite. I showed up to the office on the morning of the demo, carrying a laptop and a printout of the slides I'd been refining. There was a sense of misalignment in the room. People who normally chimed in were oddly quiet. Claire presented with practiced confidence. She used my diagrams, my code snippets, and my testing notes. People asked questions about implementation. She answered with surface-level certainty and smiled as if the content was simply hers. After, The client congratulated Claire and asked whether she could lead the next phase. My reaction at first was to document. I sent an email to the product manager labeling the differences between what had been proposed and what had been delivered. I copied the UX researcher and the architect, and I attached a branch diff with annotations. The reply was a long, polite paragraph saying the client loved the momentum and that we should keep things moving. No one asked me to explain in a meeting. No one asked for my branch. I was told the message had been received, that there would be internal alignment. That email felt like a small antiseptic slap. After the demo, the consequences came in waves that compounded. Claire got a seat at client calls. She got access to an environment I'd used only for staging. I was asked to provide support, to hand over notes, and to help Claire with the transition. The language was neutral, but the effect was clear. My work was hers now. I knew frustration is a poor public currency, so I tried to be practical. I copied deployment instructions. I wrote a readme. I stayed late twice to pair watch. The handover. I updated the unit tests. The tests passed. The CI pipeline was green. I thought things would settle. They didn't. The next escalation came as pressure. 2 weeks later, a billing discrepancy surfaced in a small hospital's account. It was subtle, a race condition that, under a particular sequence of API calls and a midnight batch job, duplicated lines on 3 patient bills. The client called the account manager, and the account manager called our product team. I was pulled into a conference room and asked to explain the root cause. I laid out the sequence, an edge case in my middleware layer that required an atomic write, something I had flagged during review but that was marked as low probability. It happened at 02:13 a.m. as a second batch job retried after a timeout. In a different life, in a different place, we had time for patch cycles. Here, the client wanted fixes now. Claire was quiet through that meeting. Later, I learned she had been on vacation and hadn't had the final code walkthrough I'd thought she'd received. That absence became part of the story for others. She had been put in an impossible position and had risen to it. She got sympathy. I got the job of writing a patch under the observation of senior managers. I did it, and I did it cleanly, but the point had shifted. The credit for the original release, that brief moment in a glass conference room with the client, had already been recognized and recorded in the internal promotion review. My patch was a footnote. It didn't earn me a line on the slide deck. It earned me more hours. Between those events, the company began to position Claire as a leader on the account. My manager called me in and said, gently, that visibility matters. He said that presenting to the client is an opportunity and that I should also put my hand up next time. I understood the message, but it felt like being asked to tidy the room after the party. The financial pressure tightened. My mother's health bill came that month with a new, unexpected balance. I made a decision to reduce expenses, fewer dinners out, pausing a class I'd been taking. Those sacrifices were microscopic threads in my life, but they were threads. The second escalation was a lie. Not an aggressive lie, more like an omission repeated until it became its own fabric. Claire began to refer to our work in emails. She would write, "We implemented the middleware and tested XYZ," and sometimes include me. Sometimes she didn't. The account manager forwarded her emails praising leadership. A director congratulated Claire on taking point. I started keeping copies of everything I sent, notes, bugs I had raised, screenshots of my local tests. I wanted a trail, that I could point to if needed. But I told myself each time that I was being procedural rather than punitive. I told myself that this was corporate life, politics and credit. Then came manipulation. Claire started to ask for my help in front of others in ways that made me look like a subordinate. "Can you walk me through the retry logic later?" she'd ask in an email copied to the architect. I did, because leaving would have been spectacle. She scheduled a one-on-one with the product manager and suggested we change the ownership model. "It'll be cleaner if one person owns the client-facing relationship," she said, and her smile made it sound like a practical improvement. I was asked to be the technical shadow, the person who would handle the messy bits. The extra hours multiplied. I accepted them because the bills did not accept my dignity as payment. Humiliation followed. At a town hall meeting, Claire described the architecture and answered a tough question from an engineering director about scaling. She named specific test cases in a way that made it sound like she had been the one running them. I sat in the back row, my hands curled around a coffee cup, and listened as people nodded. Someone from another team complimented Claire by name. Someone else asked, "Who led implementation?" And the product manager said, "Claire took point." It was a small sentence in a large room, but it displaced me. Later that day, a former colleague texted, "Nice work on the billing feature," meant for Claire but shown to me. The text stung because the sender assumed the public narrative. At home, things were thin. My mother asked gently whether I had any savings left. She said it without accusation, only concern. She had taken on extra shifts at a clinic to help with the costs. I resented myself for not being able to fix the external world that had decided to reassign my effort. That resentment was private and heavy. I saw my career as a set of small claims, accrued software commits, late-night emails, and to have them rebranded felt like a form of theft that had an engine inside it, a network of people who prefer neat stories and clean names on org charts. I tried formal routes. I scheduled a meeting with HR and showed them the commit history, the pull requests with my name, the timestamps. HR listened and said we would mediate. They suggested a facilitated meeting with Claire and the manager. I agreed. I walked into that meeting armed with a folder of evidence and calm phrases. Claire offered a version of events that included shared responsibility. She said, "I thought we were collaborating." And her voice had that particular tone of someone who knows how to be conciliatory while deflecting blame. The product manager said there had been a misunderstanding. HR advised us to document and move forward. I took HR's advice, but the environment kept changing. The third escalation was financial pressure that had bureaucratic edges. A promotion committee met and recognized Claire's client-facing leadership in their notes. They bumped her salary. They wrote a brief line recommending her for a team lead role. My manager told me there were no openings at the time and offered mentorship instead. Mentorship is rarely compensation when you have rent due and aging parents. I felt exposed. I had done the labor, but the institution rewarded the face at the client. It felt bureaucratic in a way that allowed people to feel fair while cementing an outcome. Feeling trapped, I began to plan. I copied my notes to an external drive. I exported my branches and dated folders. I documented the deployment history. I did not plan revenge. I planned evidence preservation. There is a difference. Preservation felt like insurance against false memory. College taught me how to make an argument. Years of professional life taught me the value of tracings. I kept my hands visible, but people around me started to constrict. The architect, who had once given me candid nods, stopped asking for me in design sessions. The product manager invited Claire to more client dinners. A coworker I had lunch with turned apologetic and said, "I didn't realize how it would look." That apology was nourishment and poison. It acknowledged my hurt, but asked me to absorb it. The imbalance widened. And then the low point arrived. Not an incident of humiliation, but an erosion of leverage. Our company announced a reorganization and said that headcount would be reviewed by project criticality. Because Claire had been positioned as the client lead, her project was deemed strategic. Because my name was not in the frontline narrative, my role was tagged as support. I received in the span of a week a calendar invite for a performance check. The invite had no warmth. I walked into the meeting with printed evidence, calm phrases, and a hope that facts would speak louder than reputation. My manager looked at the documents and said, "I hear you." Those words are sometimes the softest form of dismissal. In that same week, my mother's insurance called to say a claim had been denied pending additional documentation. I filled the forms, then checked my bank account and felt that cold animal fear of being one paycheck short. I felt helpless in a way that was not just about money, but about the erosion of agency. The company had already reinterpreted my contribution. My ability to change that interpretation was shrinking. I was tired enough to feel that giving up might be a kind of mercy. The lowest emotional point was quiet. It came one Tuesday night when I sat alone on my balcony and held an old printout of my earliest notes. I could feel how much of me had been parceled into product specs and emails. I thought about telling my mother to sell the apartment, about taking a position somewhere else with less prestige but more security. I slept poorly and dreamed of syntax errors that wouldn't resolve. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow suffocation of potential. I had lost leverage, the client credit, the promotion, and the small daily dignity of being recognized for the work I did. The turning point started small with a mistake nobody intended to make public. 2 days after the performance check, the client reported another billing issue, this time larger and involving a third-party integration. The system flagged a string of malformed records that affected dozens of accounts overnight. The incident kicked off a root cause analysis. The team ran through logs, tracing the flow of requests. There it was, a subtle mismatch between the schema expected by the third party and the field mapping in the version Claire had presented. That mapping was different from the one in my branch, but the logs also showed something else, a metadata trail that hadn't been scrubbed clean. I had, on a Sunday, months before, set up a local staging instance that logged author metadata in a header for debugging. It was a dumb convenience that I had promised myself to remove before production. I forgot to remove it because every time I thought about removing it, there was another emergency. The staging server retained a small header field that included my username and machine ID whenever I ran certain integration tests. When Claire pulled the files and deployed, she had used an environment copy that preserved that header. The logs that the root cause team pulled included that header on an early deployment test. In a tucked away corner of the log, my username appeared. The project manager asked me to come into a meeting with the CTO, the account director, and legal. I went because it felt like the only responsible thing to do. In that room, the CTO read the header aloud. not dramatized, simply a factual reading. He asked how that metadata came to be in production logs. My explanation was straightforward. I had left a debugging header in the staging tests. I could have framed this as my fault. I did not. I explained the sequence of events and offered to help in the technical forensics. No speeches, no accusations. The CTO then asked to see my archived and branches. My hands were not the only thing I had prepared. I produced my export, commit history with timestamps, pull requests with my name, and email threads tied to dates. Legal and the account director passed the timeline and focused on one question: who committed the version that went to the client? The answer lay in a chain of artifacts: the branch commits, the server logs with the author header, and a sequence of file modification timestamps on the deployment artifact. They found that the artifact delivered to the client included files originating from my branch. The presence of my metadata in logs suggested the deployment followed tests that originated from my environment. At the same time, Claire's public narrative, the slides, the presentation, still bore her name. The company was faced with a mismatch between what had been presented publicly and what the deploy artifacts showed. There was no thunderous revelation. The change in power was procedural. Legal recommended a joint statement acknowledging both contribution and error in the deployment. The account director wanted clarity before talking to the client. The product manager wanted to avoid a PR issue. Claire was called into a meeting where simple questions were asked about the provenance of files. She answered as she had earlier: I thought we were collaborating. She did not know about the header, and the logs proved she had not run the test that produced that header. She had used files that contained my debugging metadata. What shifted was that the artifacts could not be rearranged by narrative. They were stubborn. The company could not award a promotion based on a misattributed client face while also dealing with a deployment that required the original author to fix it. My leverage returned, but not as a theatrical vindication. Instead, it arrived as collaboration. They needed me to remediate and to restore client confidence. I remember being asked quietly whether I could lead a hotfix and coordinate with the third party. I said yes. It felt like a negotiation in which documentation did the hard work I could not ask people to do for me. There were immediate, realistic consequences. Claire was removed from the client-facing role pending an investigation into the chain of custody for the code. She was not fired. There was no evidence she had malicious intent, but she was paused. The promotion committee reversed a recommendation and opened a review into how the nomination had been handled. The company issued a careful statement to the client, an apology for the incident, an outline of corrective steps, and an acknowledgement of our engineering mistake. I was asked to participate in the client call, and when I spoke, I was concise and technical. The client listened. They asked for an estimated time to fix and for a post-mortem. I committed to both. The company authorized overtime and offered a small interim compensation for the extra hours. That didn't erase months of misattribution, but it did stop the financial bleed. The fallout drew lines. Some colleagues approached me differently. Some apologized in a way that signaled they had been complicit in a narrative. Claire reached out and asked to talk. Our conversation was short, more logistical than cathartic. She said she had been surprised by the logs and that she hadn't intended to mislead anyone. I told her the truth, that I felt pushed out and that the consequences of her presenting the work had dug into my life. She listened. There was no storm, only a quiet exchange of responsibility. She offered to help with the remediation in any way I needed, and she followed through later, sitting late beside me to rewrite a patch. She did not receive the applause of the original demo, but she did contribute to the fix. Family tensions, which had been simmering in the background, shifted as well. My mother was relieved when I told her the company had authorized overtime and that I would be on a client call that week. She stopped talking about selling the apartment. My sister, who had been protective of our small inheritance from our grandmother, called and said she had been worried about me. It was the sort of call that produces apologies without drama. "I didn't realize how much that would cost you," she said. Those small admissions mattered because they made space for practical help. My sister transferred a small amount to my account for a medical copay without saying it needed to be repaid. That, for a week, felt like oxygen. The consequences were proportionate and real. Claire's reputation at work was dented. She lost a promotion. I did not gain spectacular revenge. I received assignment leadership on the remediation and a formal recognition in the post-mortem. The recognition included a modest salary adjustment and a restored place in the project's timeline. The company reworked its presentation practices, requiring authorship checks on slides and commit provenance verification before client demos. Those changes were bureaucratic, but they were necessary. They did not fix the months I had spent unseen. They did make future misattributions harder. Most importantly for me, the way I chose to respond mattered more than any single outcome. I did not shout. I did not sabotage. I preserved evidence. I involved the right people, and I let artifacts speak in a language the organization could not ignore. The resolution felt earned because it was procedural, not theatrical. People who had been comfortable with clean narratives had to accept a more complicated one. There were leftover costs. Trust at work was frayed. I continued to view client presentations with a wariness that I hadn't had before. There were subtle reminders, an occasional conversational omission, a delayed credit on a pull request. That made me practice restraint. My mother's medical expenses continued to be a worry. Claire and I resumed a functional working relationship, but we were different. The intimacy of mutual professional trust had been replaced by a wary cooperation. In the months after the incident, I learned to focus on what I could control. I became intentional about archiving my work in institutional places, not just private folders. I suggested that the company adopt a small checklist before client presentations, a provenance check, a list of contributors, and a short tech note. It seemed boring, but it helped. The changes made my life easier in practical ways. Fewer instances where the story of authorship could be reshaped overnight. A detail that stays with me is small and domestic. One evening after the post-mortem, I went to pick up my mother from her clinic. She had a brace she'd been waiting for. On the bus, she asked gently whether I had sleep. She didn't ask about Claire or the company. She asked about me. I told her simply that I had been tired, but that things were settling. She squeezed my hand and said, in the voice only a mother can find, "You did the right thing." That was not a moral pronouncement. It was comfort. The way tea is comfort after a cold. It didn't undo the cost, but it reframed it into something that belonged to us rather than to an institutional narrative. Weeks later, I sat at my desk and looked at the new README that included the provenance checklist. It was small, and the font was default, and someone had added a short note that read, authored by, name, date, contributors, names. My name was there. The line was not a trophy. It was acknowledgement in a place where work is meant to live. It was practical and quiet. In the end, the story is not a triumph, it is a record. Claire and I both continued our careers in the company for a time. She worked on integrations and learned to ask clearer questions. I took on more client calls and learned to insist on authorship being made explicit. The company made procedural adjustments and paid for a small training session on documentation culture. None of that is cinematic. It is ordinary. It is the kind of thing that occurs when a system corrects an imbalance without turning it into a spectacle. I still think about the moment when I discovered the header and realized it would be what finally forced a reevaluation. I don't romanticize it. It was an accident of debugging and an act of preservation on my part. It was not a trap. It simply existed, and in a system that values evidence, it had the power to shift outcomes. That is the practical lesson I carry. Keep records, be lucid, and be prepared to make the labor of your life legible to others. I say that not as a moral imperative, but as a description of what worked for me. If you're watching this and you've ever had your work rebranded by someone else, know that quiet credibility and thorough documentation will not solve everything, but they will give you options. I didn't expect oral apologies or dramatic reconstructions. I expected to do the steady work of proving provenance. When the artifacts aligned with my account, the company had no polite script left to ignore them. I close this the way I began, with the fact of the theft and with the fact of a small restoration. I was hurt, I was pressured, I compromised, and I fought in the only ways that made sense inside the institutions that govern our work. I did not burn bridges. I did not build walls. I kept my evidence. I spoke when asked, and I let the technical artifacts do the work of telling the truth. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. And if you've ever had a piece of your work taken or misattributed, I'd like to know, what did you do next?